Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on April 19th, 2015. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie called Brazil. It's a comedy and it portrays a kind of futuristic society which is already here in actual fact, where bureaucrats and big private corporations run the world. So your governmental bureaucracy and the top businesses run the planet. And of course that's the definition really of fascism. They work together. You can't tell who's who, if they're actually government or private corporations, because they're so intertwined. And many of the top people or CEOs go back and forth into politics all the time as well. They never really leave their corporations, and that's really the way things really are today. Have been this way for a long time. But in Brazil, the movie, you find that even for simple things like having your air conditioning fixed in your apartment, for instance, required certain forms to be filled out by the person who resided there. And you'll see workmen turning up and they say, well, we can't do anything unless you got form number so-and-so signed and put in a request, etc. And that's where we are today. With globalization and this world global system, you can call it fascist or socialist, doesn't matter, it's all the same thing actually. If you go into the roots and histories of it and who set them up in the first place, and they certainly weren't people on the streets who set up these societies that we're living in today. They were funded by incredibly big, wealthy banking corporations a long time ago. But in the movie version, you'll see the Department of Information, Retrieval and so on, where it's a massive building, a massive tower, where high security is there and so on, and everybody's business is known about. You're all given your ID numbers, you all have your life history stored there, where you work, how many jobs you've had, where you worked at and so on. Your complete personality profile is in this Department of Information Retrieval. But it's quite interesting how, using various analogies in a movie version, or a satire, you can really show what the world is already like, in fact. Under different guises, they've got Homeland Security in the US and the same kind of things in other countries as well. They're all the same things with different names sometimes. That's how they confuse you, so you never catch on to the system you're actually living under. Most folk never even think they're living under a system other than what's portrayed by the mainstream or the newsman of a democracy, and you vote and your politicians do all the rest. Nothing is further from the truth, and it hasn't been anywhere near that for an awful long time. But this last week I had my own little, one of the many experiences you get today, with my phone going out, and it got restored yesterday, Friday, and a week prior to that, 1 week exactly in fact, it went out, and I had to make a phone call to the vet in the morning, on Friday morning, 1 week ago. And what happened was, the phone was fine in the morning. I phoned the vet. They couldn't take him. So I got off the phone and was going through the phone book to find other vets. And the police turned up 20 minutes after that one call. And they said a 911 call had me come from this number. And I said it's impossible, as I've only made one call this morning, that was to the vet. And they said, yeah, one of the officers asked me, he says, any problems with the phone line, crackling or anything like that? I says, no, there's always some kind of problems with it crackling and so on, but that's been that way for a long time. I said, well, no, to me that was normal. And they went away. So I got another vet, phoned up again, and then took Hamish, the dog, off to the vet. He had a little problem with his anal glands, common problem, as the dogs get older. Anyway, I came back, and that evening, there was no phone at all. Literally, there was just a hum, a massive, awful hum. You couldn't phone out. Well, they don't repair. The Bell Telephones doesn't repair on weekends, so I waited till, actually the Tuesday, I had to go outside the house to find a place with a phone, a record phone. So I phoned up from a gas station on the Tuesday, and you go through these pre-recorded messages first of all. Punch this, punch that for this, that, and the other. And then I punched in the number of my home phone number, and they said, the problem has already been reported, and the matter has been fixed this morning. Well, my phone still wasn't working. But anyway, I continued with this pre-recorded thing at the gas station, and then I got a live person in India. Because you see, they use the complaints department for all the fixings and so on in India. And the person could hardly speak any English. And awfully difficult to understand, and they couldn't understand me either. But anyway, I think I got through to say that, well, the problem is this, and could you send somebody out to repair it? So I got all the kind of promises and so on you would get from India, because India is a strange culture. If you live there or you visit or whatever, you'll find that the old term come soon mon that they use in Jamaica applies even more so in India, where you're told anything just to make you go away happy. But the next day, of course, it still wasn't working. No repair person would come to the door to check the lines coming into the house or anything else. Because normally you have to trace it from the house, and then you'll trace it along the line outside, find out the nearest junctions, find out if there's bad connections, and that's generally where they are and so on. But anyway, no one came. And so on the Wednesday, called again, and I couldn't get the answers as to why this had happened. They didn't know. It's an utter mystery in India as to why it wasn't fixed yet. And then the next day was the same thing, you see, the Thursday. So on the Thursday, another guy from India said that, because I was trying to find out why this 9/11 call was made, and why there was also a report put in before I reported the problem on my line. From whom? And I thought maybe there's crossed lines or something. And he said to me, he says, well, it's a self-reporting monitoring system. I says, monitoring what? He says, well, it monitors the lines. And he said that they're supposed to detect if there's a problem. So I gather it's maybe a computerized or whatever it is. Anyway, that night I got someone's cell phone who keep at the house. And I was sitting next to my landline phone, called him again and said, in India, of course, could you dial my number home? Because they were sure it was fixed. And listening on the cell phone at the same time and talking, and I chatted away to the woman and so on. And I says, well, have you dialed? She says, yeah, your phone's been ringing for a minute and a half. I says, well, I'm glad someone's phone is ringing, but it's not here. It's somewhere else. So something was crossed somewhere, obviously. And maybe I thought, well, I don't want to get a massive bill here, because if someone else is using my landline in a cross connection, then I'm paying for it all, you see, and things like that. Anyway, the next day, the next morning, it still wasn't working on this Friday past, yesterday, or 2 days ago. And about 2:30 in the afternoon, the phone rang for the first time in a week. And on comes a Canadian voice. And he says, well, that's your phone fix, he says. And this is a guy who does actual repair. And he was only called, he said, he got a call late the night before. And he came out in the morning, and he worked on it and found it. And it was a junction, sure enough, somewhere outside on the line, not inside the house at all, and not even pretty well near the house. But he repaired it, and that was that. But as we go more and more into this offshore investments and offshore systems, because it's cheap for the big corporations to use their facilities abroad, it gets more and more bizarre and third world-ish for us back home, you see, when you have to go a whole week to find to get a problem solved, where the same guy who called me, the bell repairman, who actually called me when he got it going, was the same guy who fixed it a year before, last year. Because it goes digital every year, you see. So out of this, I found out, I think I understand what's happening, that because they're putting these high fiber optic cables along the main roads where houses are and so on, that's part of the Human Corridor projects under Agenda 21, of course. You find that they don't branch out too far beyond it. So the people can get their package deals with their TV, their phone, high-speed internet and so on alongside these routes. But if you're outside of that, even about a mile or so outside of that main human corridor, habitat corridor, then you're still on the old lines, and they're not giving any priorities at all to the old telephone lines. In fact, one of the calls I made to India, the woman, after about half an hour talking, thought I was on some kind of cable package. I says, no, I've no package at all. All I've got is the old-fashioned telephone line, a normal telephone line, and so on. But it would seem that most folk now are getting all their package deals. But if you're outside, then you don't. And you don't get the high-speed internet either. So you have to get either a satellite or some other means to get or Wi-Fi from a tower or something like that. And that's an incentive, of course, for families, especially those with children, to move into the human corridor, habitat corridors, where they can get the high-speed cable and all the rest of it. So you're seeing this all the time. Forms of coercion are used on people, where literally eventually they'll stop maintaining lines outside that corridor, and they'll say it's unsustainable, albeit it's just not cost effective to repair that one telephone line, or even the few that may be along it. And you're forced into their system or forced to move. Coercion is one of the easiest ways to make people do things, maybe against their natural will, but they will go along with it because they'll get some kind of cost benefit, or which means a cost punishment if you don't. That's how coercion works, of course. It's interesting to see, as I say, how most of the computerized systems too, and the complaints department on anything goes through India as well. And it can be a nightmare, as I'm sure many of you know that, if you've got problems with the internet or so on, if you have to go through the India system. But that's the system we live in today, as we go completely, utterly global. We are global, actually, completely. And now they're simply, as you know, tidying up the rules and regulations for corporate interests all over the world. The same corporations, by the way. There's only a few corporations in existence, top corporations, and they own the subsidiaries of many other corporations you don't even know they're affiliated with. That's how it's been for quite a long time now. Monopolies run the world. And for a long time, I've done so many articles on the globalization issue, where the same monopolies are just adding to their monopolies by buying over even private water rights, things like that, getting government on board always to pass laws so you can't even own your own water if you're a private citizen, and everything belongs eventually to the corporations who can manage it all better than you. You have this public-private partnership deal where we pay for all the costs of businesses and so on that join it through our tax money that's handed to them, the corporations, and they simply, we pay for the running costs, repairs and everything. They simply have the profits, the private part of it, and that's how it's going. So eventually all things will be ruled, like the old joke said years ago when I was a small child. The jokes in the paper used to say that eventually the World Corporation will own everything. And that's not an exaggeration at all. Your food supply, your water supply, electricity, everything is to be owned by private corporate. Everything you need to live, that's all energy for heat, you name it, is to be owned by private corporations and reinforced by our governments that pass laws to make it so. The world that we live in is completely different from the one you've been trained to believe it is, in as far as the way it actually works. It's not democracy at all. I've gone into the history, for instance, of the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England, London I should say, that was formed to set up a form of world government which the big bankers of the day that formed the members of the inner party, they call themselves, of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and they would set policies for government to follow. They took members from all the higher walks of life and put them into government too. So prime ministers for all the years right to the present have been members of this. Many people, in fact, thought it was a communist organization. This is given a royal charter to exist, remember. That's its lies, a royal charter. And it's a private, not-for-profit, supposedly, corporation. But it's the maker, it's the organization in Britain that makes a person's career to get up into the power politics of the real political world and global infrastructure and so on, and dealing with policies for governments, national governments too. The British Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on, which are still in existence, they're still completely bound to this system, are exactly the same. And they have their Canadian Council on Foreign Affairs, Australian, New Zealand, and so on. And these guys run what's taught in universities. In fact, they're teamed with universities under private programs to set policies for teaching the students and the future leaders that are subservient to them because of their big fat paychecks. Because if you get picked up in university and work hard at their agendas and don't ask too many questions, you get incredible promotion once you go into actually working. You might end up as a CEO of a big corporation, for instance, and things like that. So we're run by people we don't know. We're run by people we don't elect, and they're private institutions that came out initially from the Lord Alfred Milner Group. That's what it was called before they gave themselves the Royal Institute for International Affairs name. And they were comprised of the elite of the day, power, banking, international, etc., and their sons also were members of it too. They set policies for taking over the world's resources back then, and their personal historian, Professor Carl Quigley, wrote about it in the Anglo-American Establishment, the title of one of his books, where he's quite honest about this group existing for an awful long time, and actually since the late 1800s. And that every president of the US, for instance, he says, has been a member of this ever since, regardless of the name changes of the organization. Very secretive initially. In fact, so secretive up until about 1940s, even Winston Churchill wasn't aware of the actual name of the particular group that ran Britain. It ran its affairs, it ran its policies. It stirred up trouble with certain countries to get wars started, including world wars, by the way. That's in their own archive section. And how they bring in a global government system, but not a sort of happy democratic system that you're all taught about. And many of the left wing follow it for that reason. They think it's all for the good. It's not that at all. They believe that experts and the natural eugenical elite should rule the world. Ones who had proven through their genes and their marriages of always marrying the higher type, supposedly, that they had the right to rule the world. Nothing's changed, except now they have various branches underneath them, under different names to confuse you all, so that you don't know the top organization above it all. You see your local one or even your national organizations through universities, but you don't know exactly who started them up or why. Now, one of these organizations that simply is a part of the same organization, this world organization that was part of the British Empire system and still is actually, is the Centre for International Governance Innovation, called CIGI. This is what it says here in Wikipedia, which is I can have a very surface rundown, but it says it's an independent how can you be independent? You find out if you think about what I'm saying as I read this article here. Independent, non-partisan, again, think about that when you see the names that pop up in this. Think tank on global governance in Canada, led by experienced practitioners of what? And distinguished academics. CIGI supports research, forms networks, advances policy debate, actually creates the policy debates, and generates ideas for multilateral governance improvements. Conducting an active agenda of research, events and publications, CIGI's interdisciplinary work includes collaboration with policy, business and academic communities around the world. Now remember, the Royal Institute for International Affairs group was centred in Oxford, England, the university, and actually in the All Souls College there for the higher members and their lifelong members to set global policy, including that for Britain. And they have them in these organisations across Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And it said here that it's, and of course, they're a think tank. Now, when you put something under a charitable or non-profit organisation that has an army of non-governmental organisations working under it, and it helps create the careers of the members while in university that brings in to do various studies and so on, you're looking at a very private, influential, powerful system of running the country, and they hope for the world too, in a form of governance, which is more user-friendly than government, global government, which of course is the ultimate goal. But it's also to go into a world, if you really go into the documentation of it, where experts rule the world again, because people are just too stupid to do it themselves. Anyway, it says, until September 2014, CIGI was headquartered in the former Seagram Museum in the Uptown district of Waterloo, Ontario. That's where the university is. It's now situated in the CIGI campus, which also houses the CIGI Auditorium in the Basel School of International Affairs. See, it's all one organisation, folks. Don't be fooled by the separate names here. This is still the Royal Institute for International Affairs, a Canadian branch, you see. The establishment of CIGI has been recognised as a major contributor to the growth of local knowledge economy. So they're already involved in Waterloo. They influence decisions by the council, no doubt by education, and it helps. I'm no doubt too this helps set curriculums, because the Royal Institute for International Affairs, set up by these banking boys and their sons who did the groundwork around the world to take over the world's resources, eventually branched into creating policies via universities and choosing and training future world leaders in all different areas of global governance, you see. Under the United Nations, which again the Royal Institute of International Affairs set up and put forth using the US to promote it, initially under the League of Nations, but they used their US branch, the CFR, to push it into World War I. And it became the United Nations. The United Nations has an umbrella of them all, and the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, all these organizations, even amalgamated European bank system, all comes under this organization, Royal Institute for International Affairs, CFR, CIGI, etc. They're all one organization in different branches, sometimes working on different parts of their policies. So anyway, it says the growth of local knowledge and economy surrounding Waterloo region. In 2007, the city of Waterloo was named the world's top intelligent community. What they create too are these model cities, they call them, under the United Nations, where they're members of the CFR, Royal Institute for International Affairs, Canadian Institute for International Affairs. They help set the policies for the cities and so on via the councillors that are there. And often they bring some councillors on board to make sure they get the policies through. Now it says, CIGI was founded in 2001. Up until then, you simply had the CFR name, the Canadian Council on Foreign Relations and Foreign Affairs, which you still have, but it's a division of them. It was founded in 2001 by Jim Balsillie, co-CEO of Research in Motion, who did BlackBerry, following his vision to lay the framework for an institution tasked with helping solve the world's most pressing challenges. So it's amazing that everyone who makes an awful lot of money out of the blue, just a sudden genius, suddenly become these great philanthropists that want to change the world and want to get involved in all governmental policies and educational policies and everything else. It's just amazing to me, isn't it? But if you've ever gone into the way it works, and I think it was Glenn Ford, the actor, set up his own little foundation to challenge a lot of what he knew was going on in his day. And he put a movie out called Brotherhood of the Bell. He paid for it himself to show you how through secret organizations, doesn't matter what they're called, and you take oaths and all the rest of it to the organization, then the doors would open for you and money would flow in and business, whatever it happened to be, career-wise. The sky was the limit if you obeyed their agenda. And it's a good analogy to how the whole system works with what I'm talking about right now. It says, Balsillie made an initial donation of $20 million to establish the New Economy Institute, renamed CIGI, in 2002. With Mike Lazaridis, sounds like an infection that raises you from the dead, eh? Lazaridis, his then co-CEO at RIM, contributing an additional $10 million. The combined $30 million in funds, this is for a private, non-profit, was matched by the government of Canada. The taxpayers paid another $30 million to them. That's how it works in every country, folks. If you think you've got free independence and all the rest of it, no. Among CIGI's first staff was its initial executive director, John English, director of public affairs, John Milroy, and distinguished fellows Andrew F. Cooper and Paul Heinbecker. The first CIGI International Board of Governors was held in October 2003 with early members including Jagdish Bhagwati, Joe Clark, Angel Guria, and Anne-Marie Slaughter. It says in 2005, CIGI published its first working paper and experienced rapid growth in its research agenda, publications, and public events programming. In 2007, CIGI partnered with the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University to launch the BSIA. In 2009, CIGI announced plans to house the BSIA within a CIGI campus that would be built alongside its headquarters in Waterloo. The resulting $69 million complex received federal and provincial funding totaling $50 million through the Knowledge Infrastructure Program and Ontario's 2009 budget. The City of Waterloo donated the land for the campus through a 9-year lease. Not bad, eh? And then it says, construction of the CIGI campus was complete in November 2011. That year, CIGI celebrated its 10th anniversary with the opening of the CIGI campus and published a CIGI at 10 retrospective book celebrating its history. In May 2012, Rohinton Medora joined CIGI as a president after having served on CIGI's International Board of Governors since 2009. So International Board of Governors too, you see. Medora is former Vice President of Programs at the International Development Research Centre. Medora succeeded former CIGI Executive Director by Thomas A. Burns, who previously held high-level positions at the International Monetary Fund. Interesting, eh? That all the organizations set up by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, a private organization with a strict agenda, more widely known years ago than it is today. It's been very quiet as to what it's really up to. But they set up the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the rest of it. All private institutions, by the way, owned by their members. So here you go. Medora is the former Vice President of Programs at the International Development Research Centre. Medora succeeded former CIGI Executive Director by Thomas Burns, previously held the high-level position at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Government of Canada. Interesting, eh? CIGI's senior management team also includes former Toronto Star editor-in-chief, because they have all the top moguls for the newspapers chains and so on, and TV media chains and all that. Star editor-in-chief Jai Fred Kuntz as vice president of public affairs, and David B. Dewitt, former associate vice president of research, social sciences and humanities at York University, who now serves as CIGI's vice president of programs. It says, in 2013, CIGI appointed Domenico Lombardi as director of its Global Economy Program, the Global Economy Program. Lombardi is a former chair at the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy. No kidding, eh? And has held positions on executive boards of major international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund once again, and once again the World Bank. While CIGI's earlier research focused solely on international relations and the international economy, the Centre's program now examines three themes: the global economy, global security and politics, and international law. To integrate all the economies of the world and the systems and the governments into one system, you must always use international law bit by bit by bit. That's how they formed the European Union, and it's still ongoing with total integration with that. So CIGI's Global Economy Program includes analysis on macroeconomic regulation, financial regulation and trade policy. This program is a central area of the think tank's expertise, especially in the wake of the global financial crisis. So they're independent, it's a private, non-profit think tank that just happens to work with governments to advise them on all policies. And no one elects these private organizations. They're appointed by private institutions. And CIGI's Global Economy researchers were directly involved in the process that led to 2000 creation on the G20 at the leaders level, and have conducted an active G20 outreach program since the 2009 Pittsburgh G20 summit. The Centre's Global Security and Politics program examines a range of issues in peace, conflict and security, including Arctic governance is another thing too, internet governance and security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. They set up the whole staff and president of the government for the new internet governance, by the way. What's your government for, except rubber stamping? What private organizations put forward to them. The right ones, of course. You know. This is CIGI's International Law Research Program, was announced in November 2013, focuses on three key areas: intellectual property law, international economic, financial and investment law, regulation and governance, and environmental law and treaties. They're one of the biggest organizations to push this total integration of the economy and sustainability, global warming, taxes on carbon and all the rest of it. Because you see, all of that, including the United Nations, is owned by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, that runs all of the topics that you hear about all the time on the news that's going to affect all your lives. And it goes through some of the experts. Now, distinguished practitioners, researchers and academics produce CIGI research outputs, exploring and contributing to CIGI's 4 research programs. Now, this goes on to talk about publications they put out. You find that the CFR churns them out as well, and they're involved in other think tanks under the same umbrella as Royal Institute for International Affairs. But anyway, this says CIGI publications include books and e-books, papers, special reports, policy briefs, and conference reports. Publications are available online, generally under a Creative Commons license, with some editions available in print. Notable publications. Now, the ones in print, by the way, are generally expensive. That's how they do it. And generally way too expensive, because they don't want the general public reading it. They want their members to read it or have copies at home, of course. It says notable publications include special reports, papers, commentaries, and series that have focused on improving the G20 process. Now, it's interesting too, this private organization, Royal Institute for International Affairs, CFR, and all other names it goes under, created the G20. It was not voted in by the public. In fact, it was never put to the public, any more than the United Nations was put to the public as an idea that should be voted on. Then it goes on to say the global financial crisis, sovereign debt, restructuring, constructive powers, Arctic governance, internet governance, and the Millennium Development Goals. That's Agenda 21, for those who don't know about it. So here they are doing all of this stuff that you hear, always mentioned in the media, but they never tell you who's behind it and where these policy things come from, you see. And why governments taking stuff put out by the private institutions and running with it as though it's their own policies. That's how the public perceive it. The politicians are putting all this through themselves, but it's done by these private, non-elected organizations. And it says public-private events are held regularly at the CIGI in addition to policy workshops and public lectures. CIGI holds conferences that gather experts and policymakers from around the world to discuss possible solutions to the issues raised by CIGI's research. And it says notable past guest speakers at CIGI-sponsored events include Paul Martin, Ernesto Zedillo, Dr. James Orbinski, Emma Rothschild, Jose Antonio Ocampo, Jeff Rubin, Dambisa Moyo, Paul Krugman, and Jeffrey Sachs, it says. Partners, and it says you got, since its inception, CIGI is partnered with other think tanks, because it's all one big, massive world group of think tanks, folks, run and set up by the same organization that set up this group. It says, so the partnership with organizations around the world, partnership is currently underway with Institute for New Economic Thinking, an organization funded by George Soros, well, naturally, to bring about ideas that will lead to lasting solutions to the world's various economic challenges. Well, he helped create, George Soros, as you know, his history, a lot of the economic challenges of the world too. He's crashed economies with a couple of his buddies, as he did in Britain, through their very clever way of taking down the country, forcing Britain to borrow from, again, the big private moneylenders again. Other current and past partners include Chatham House, that's the headquarters for Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Brookings Institution, C.D. Howe Institute, Inter-American Dialogue, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, International Relations and Security Network, and the Stanley Foundation. See, all these big private foundations that were the front organizations for the big corporate boys at the top. They set up a long time ago. Carnegie, all these big boys are connected, you see. It goes through more the story and so on, about different people involved with it, etc., etc. So that's the Wikipedia article on them too. And I won't go in too much depth on who set them up, really, as I mentioned here. And from their own website, it says here that the Center for International Governance and Innovation is an independent, non-partisan think tank. Independent, although they've got millions of dollars from the government of Canada and the local government and so on. Independent, non-partisan think tank. Not bad if you can start up money like that, eh? Focused on international governance, led by experienced practitioners and distinguishers that support research, forms networks, advances policy debates, and generates ideas for multilateral governance improvements. So it's quite something. It says here, mission is to build bridges from knowledge to power by conducting world-leading research and analysis and influencing policymakers, that's your politicians. So here's your politicians, make sure they get your tax money so that the same think tanks can do their own pre-written out agenda to give to the policymakers in government. Right? And it says their beliefs here is better international governance can improve the lives of people everywhere by increasing prosperity, right? Where have you heard that 1,000 times over? Ensuring global sustainability, that's your greening agenda, depopulation agenda, and austerity agenda. Addressing inequality and safeguarding human rights, and promoting a secure world, and so on. So I'll put some of these links up tonight for those that want to look for it, because it's quite something, really. It's quite something when you see what's really going on in these organizations. Now, if you just take the other branch, one of the other branches that's run by the same organization that runs CIGI, is the Council on Foreign Relations in the US. And you'll find, for instance, that Lloyd Axworthy, who was up in government in Canada, was the head of the CFR for the US for a long time. Anyway, Because it's the same organization, you see. It says, Council on Foreign Relations says, founded in 1921, is a United States non-profit, again, 4,900 member organization, publisher, and think tank, here we go again, specializing in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, headquartered in New York City, with an additional office in Washington, D.C., naturally. You understand, these guys create the policies for the U.S. as well. Well as Britain, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and so on. Its membership has included senior politicians, more than a dozen secretaries of state, CIA directors, the bankers, lawyers, professors, and senior media figures. Everybody who gives you your reality and runs the system belongs to it. The CFR promotes globalization, free trade, reducing financial regulations on transnational corporations. In other words, that's who started up. Big bankers started up, remember. And economic consolidation into regional blocs such as NAFTA. And they were the ones who drafted up the NAFTA integration policy and European policy under the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Private organization drafted it all up for governments to sign onto. And they did sign onto it because they were told to, because the leaders of the governments are members of it too. As I never mentioned, when they run for election, what they belong to, is it? And nobody asks them. The CFR meetings convene government officials, global business leaders, and prominent members of the intelligence foreign policy community to discuss international issues. CFR publishes the bi-monthly journal Foreign Affairs and runs the think tank David Rockefeller Studies Program, which influences foreign policy by making recommendations to the presidential administration and diplomatic community, testifying before Congress, interacting with the media, which all the media moguls are members of it too, and publishing on foreign policy issues. Well, how can you possibly call yourself a democracy when your policy is to keep the people completely in the dark as to who is really running the country, where all these policies are made and by whom? And that these policies are made by organizations already have set policies and missions for the last 100 years as to where they want to take the world on behalf of the financial elite that run the big top corporations of the world. Why bother voting at all when they keep the public in the dark and in ignorance, and put forth these little members at the bottom, whichever is presidents or prime ministers, as frontmen, to give you the farce that you're still a democracy. But the people truly are kept in the dark about all of this. Truly are. Now, just to give you how they started off in the States and their history, it says Elihu Root is a powerful corporate lawyer. He was a frontman for big, massive corporations, who served as Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and U.S. Senator, headed the first Council on Foreign Relations with a small group of New York financiers, as bankers, the private bankers, and lawyers. But they were the biggest ones that became the Federal Reserve, by the way, too, or were the Federal Reserve. Towards the end of World War I, a working fellowship of about 150 scholars called the Inquiry, that's the term they gave themselves there, because they were really run from Britain by the Milner Group, before the Milner Group changed its name to Royal Institute of International Affairs. So in the States they called it Inquiry. Was tasked to brief President Woodrow Wilson about options for the post-war world when Germany was defeated. This academic band, including Wilson's closest advisor and longtime friend, Colonel Edward M. House, who was in direct contact with Lord Grey, and Lord Grey from England, was one of the top men for the Milner Group at the time, Lord Alfred Milner Group, that ran the British Empire system. Anyways, as well as Walter Lippmann, met to assemble a strategy for the post-war world. The team produced more than 2,000 documents detailing and analysing the political, economic and social facts globally that would be helpful for Wilson in the peace talks. Now, going into their private archives, the Council on Foreign Relations, Professor Carol Quigley, who was an archivist for a while, who was all for it and had no beefs with it at all, he said that They helped set the whole of US policies and agenda. And they also wanted wars initially to bring on global government and get folk onto their knees so they would give up nationalism and so on. Then again, the correct people, the big top banking folk and the experts would run the world, you see, for their own sakes at the top and their high profits and so on, and the monopoly structure of corporations. Anyway, it says here, the reports formed the basis for the 14 points which outlined Wilson's strategy for peace after war's end. They then travelled to Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and participated in discussions there. As a result of discussions at the Peace Conference, a small group of British and American diplomats and scholars met on May 30th, 1919 at the Hotel Majestic in Paris and decided to create an Anglo-American organisation called the Institute of International Affairs. It's quite amazing how they actually keep the Lord Alfred and all the group out of it to this day. This is which would have offices in London and New York. Due to the isolationist views prevalent in American society at the time, the scholars had difficulty gaining traction with their plan and turned their focus instead to a set of discrete meetings that had been taking place since June 1918 in New York City under the name Council on Foreign Relations. So again, you give it a more interesting, a more secretive kind of name, basically, like who cares, one of these private groups on foreign relations. Not realizing it runs your economic system, all the top members, your political system completely, and your future as well, because they plan the future. The meetings were headed by the corporate lawyer Elihu Root, who served as Secretary of State under President Theodore Roosevelt, and attended by 108 high-ranking officers of banking, manufacturing, trading and finance companies, together with many lawyers, naturally. The members were proponents of Wilson's internationalism, but were particularly concerned about the effect that the war and the Treaty of Peace might have on post-war business, their own businesses. The scholars from the inquiry saw an opportunity here to create an organisation that brought diplomats, high-level government officials, and academics together with lawyers, bankers, and industrialists to engineer government policy. Now, that can go over your head, but listen again. Remember, this is like Wall Street, the top bankers of the early Federal Reserve and the Chase Manhattan Bank, all these big boys. This is and top corporate guys who already owned huge businesses in the States. It says that they want to basically create an organization that brought diplomats, high-level government officials, and academics together with lawyers, bankers, and industrialists to engineer government policy. Did you vote any of the bankers in? No. To your democracy? No. Together with lawyers, did you vote any of the lawyers in? No. Did you vote any of the guys from academia in? No. Did you vote the industrialists in? No. Did you give anybody the right to engineer government policy? No. Nothing's changed to this present day, folks. So on July 29th, 1921, they filed a certification of academics together with lawyers and so on. The creation of incorporations. They incorporated themselves, officially forming the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1922, Edwin F. Gay, former dean of the Harvard Business School and director of Shipping Board during the war, spearheaded the Council's efforts to begin publication of a magazine that would be the authoritative source on foreign policy. The authoritative source, a private magazine that would be the authoritative source on foreign policy that all the little lackeys of politicians would read to, you see. He gathered $25,000 from the wealthy members of the council, and via sending letters soliciting funds to the 1,000 richest Americans. Using these funds, the first issue of Foreign Affairs was published September 22, and within a few years had gained a reputation as the most authoritative American review dealing with international relations. So there you go. That's how it's done. That's how it's done, folks. Everybody who knows what the CFR is a member of the establishment, and you have to be to get up there, not to get in the first place. And the doors are open for you, and up you go. And through their charitable foundations and the guys who put forth as inventors and so on, suddenly get millions of dollars as a genius, become philanthropists for them and funnel money into other big projects for their world agenda. Always the same world agenda. In the late 1930s, the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation began contributing large amounts of money to the council. In 1938, they created various committees on foreign relations, which later became governed by the American Committees on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Naturally, that's where the Congress is. Throughout the country, funded by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation. See, all these big non-profit corporations and foundations, you see, are all working on the same, they're all part of the same structure, same group, which is the same one at the top. Influential men were to be chosen in a number of cities and would then be brought together for discussions in their own communities, as well as participating in an annual conference in New York. These local committees serve to influence local leaders and shape public opinion to build support for the council's policies. That's what they're doing with their sustainability and everything else, and the cap and trade taxes for the carbon and all the rest of it. It's all these boys who put it all forth. This is while also acting as useful listening posts throughout which the council and US government could sense the mood of the country. They create the mood of the country, then they sense it to make sure it's working on the public. Beginning in 1939, lasting for 5 years, the council achieved much greater prominence within the government and the State Department when it established the strictly confidential War and Peace Studies, funded entirely by the Rockefeller Foundation. The secrecy surrounding the group was such that the council members who were not involved in its deliberations were completely unaware of the study group's existence. So you see, they also, just like the Royal Institute of International Affairs, have their inner party at the top and their outer party of workers beneath them. And the inner one is much more secretive, as there's true goals, names, and so on. So it says, it was divided into 4 functional topic groups: economic and financial, security and armaments, territorial and political. The security and armaments group was headed by Alan Welsh Dulles, who later became a pivotal figure in the CIA's predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. The CFR ultimately produced 682 memoranda for the State Department, marked classified and circulated amongst the appropriate government departments. So he's your private corporation running the OSS, becoming the CIA, and running your State Department and everything else. Hasn't changed to this day. It's the same. Still going on. It's just the same. And they've pretty well achieved some of their goals. They're on this whole century's plans for this whole century, the new American century. It says, a critical study found that 502 government officials surveyed from 1945 to 1972, more than half were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. More than half got their jobs actually in government by being members of the Council, then put into those jobs. During the Eisenhower administration, 40% of the top U.S. foreign policy officials were Council on Foreign Relations members. Eisenhower himself had been a Council member under Truman. 42% of the top posts were filled by Council members. During the Kennedy administration, this number rose to 51% and peaked at 57% under the Johnson administration. This is in an anonymous piece called The Sources of Soviet Conduct that appeared in Foreign Relations in 1947. The Council on Foreign Relations Study Group members George Kennan coined the term containment. This would prove to be highly influential in U.S. foreign policy for 7 upcoming presidential administrations. So it says, William Bundy created the CFR study groups with helping to do the framework of thinking that led to the Marshall Plan of Lend-Lease. Of course, the big banks massively profited off that, of other countries. And NATO. So your big war-making machine was also run and created by the members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Due to new interest in the group, membership grew towards 1,000 because everybody wants to get up. All the psychopaths flood into it. This article says, Dwight D. Eisenhower chaired the CFR study group while he served as president of Columbia University. One member later said, whatever General Eisenhower knows about economics, he's learned from the study group meetings. the CFR study group devised an expanded study group called Americans for Eisenhower to increase his chances for the presidency. So they make sure that all the think tanks, policymakers get on board to pick their presidents and prime ministers. Eisenhower would later draw many cabinet members from the CFR ranks, and actually there's a good lot of the bureaucrats are at the federal level are picked too. And it says from CFR ranks, he became a CFR member himself. His primary CFR appointment was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Dulles gave a public address at the Harold Pratt House, that's the headquarters in New York City. In Britain, of course, it's Chatham House, as in New York City, in which he announced a new direction for Eisenhower's foreign policy. It says, after a speech that was made there, the Council convened a session on nuclear weapons and foreign policy and chose Henry Kissinger, another member, you see, to head it. And Kissinger also is a member of the Trilateral Commission, which is another branch of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, again, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Yeah, so Kissinger spent the following academic year working on a project called at House Council Headquarters. The book of the same name he published from his research in 1957 gave him national recognition, topping the national bestseller list. Naturally it did, because of the promotion they gave through all the controlled media, who were all, the members were at the top, were all magnates again, newspaper magnates that belonged to the CFR too. So they can make stars, and they do, they make stars. On November 24, 1953, a small group heard a report from the political scientist William Henderson regarding the ongoing conflict between France and Vietnamese Communist leader Ho Chi Minh Viet Minh forces, a struggle that would later become known as the First Indochina War. Henderson argued that Ho's cause was primarily nationalist in nature and that Marxism had little to do with the current revolution. Further, the report said the United States could work with Ho to guide his movement away from communism. State Department officials, however, expressed skepticism about direct American intervention in Vietnam, and the idea was tabled. Over the next 20 years, the U.S. would find itself allied with anti-communist South Vietnam and against Ho and his supporters in the Vietnam War. It says the Council served as a breeding ground for important American policies, such as mutual deterrence, arms control, and nuclear non-proliferation. In 1962, the group began a program of bringing select Air Force officers to the Harold Pratt House to study alongside its scholars. So all top members of the military are members of it as well. The Army, Navy, and Marine Corps requested they start similar programs for their own officers. A 4-year study of relations between America and China were conducted by the Council between 1964 and 1968. One study published in 1966 concluded that American citizens were more open to talks with China than their elected leaders, and so on and so on. It goes on more and more about Vietnam. It says in November 1979, while chairman of the CFR, David Rockefeller became embroiled in an international incident when he and Henry Kissinger, along with John J. McCloy and Rockefeller aides, persuaded President Jimmy Carter, who was also a CFR member, through the State Department to admit the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into the U.S. for hospital treatment for lymphoma. This action directly participated in what is known as the Iran hostage crisis and placed Rockefeller under intense media scrutiny, particularly from the New York Times, for the first time in his public life. Well, Rockefeller was the guy actually who was chairman of the damn board for this private organization for a long time too. He also was completely involved in with his brothers in the CIA. So anyway, as in his book, The White House Diary, Carter wrote of the affair in April 9th, 1979. David Rockefeller came in, apparently to induce me to let the Shah come to the United States. Rockefeller, Kissinger, and Brzezinski seem to be adopting this as a joint project. Now, don't think for a minute that these names that have been there for such a long time, Rockefeller, Kissinger, and Brzezinski, that's when it all ended. No. It's still there today. Brzezinski's still on the go. Kissinger's still on the go. And the Rockefellers are still held involved in their think tank too. And plus, you have other names now too that try to keep out the limelight. They're in high positions of this foreign policy and all the rest of it, and your banking, you name it. As is here, their mission on their website says the CFR's mission is to be a resource for its members, government officials, business executives, journalists, educators and students, civic and religious leaders, and other interested citizens in order to help them better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the US and other countries. Everything that gives you your reality, that's all education, everything, is on board with this one organization that sets all their policies. CFR promotes globalization and free trade, reducing financial regulations on transnational corporations and economic consolidation into regional blocs, such as NAFTA, the European Union, and develops policy recommendations that reflects these goals. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And they're massive organizations, these so-called private, supposedly think tanks. And they place people into politics for you to vote for. In all parties, by the way, the leaders are members of this organization. Quite something. It's quite something. So, it says here, this is a little interesting thing too, it says, the corporate membership, 250 total, is divided into associates, affiliates, that's $30,000 plus, President's Circle, $60,000 plus, and founders, $100,000 plus. All corporate executive members have opportunities to hear distinguished speakers, such as overseas presidents and prime ministers, chairmen and CEOs of multinational corporations, and US officials and congressmen. President and premium members are also entitled to other benefits, including attendance at small private dinners or receptions with senior American officials and world leaders. This is the organization that helps run the world, does run the world, in fact. And you keep voting the front men they put forward in, because you're still stuck in left wing and right wing. Remember what Quigley said? He says, we don't care who comes in. He says, we take in members from communism, fascism, dictatorships, and so on around the world. The whole idea is to make sure that all the leaders are yours. And the leaders of industry are yours. The leaders of the banking systems, the top ones, are yours. And CEOs of big international corporations are yours. In fact, to be a CEO of a top international corporation, you have to start off as a member, and they open the doors and push you up. Same in politics, and same in everything else. Academia, you name it. That's how the world really is run. And it's all run, again, by the main headquarters one in England, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And Canada's the same. So is Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries now too. That's how it's really run. They set up the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund. They own them, private institutions. And all the globalization institutions, they run and operate. They set the policies for every country. They set all the policies of the United Nations for all the treaties. They draft them up, and the UN then gives it to us. And the CFR members sign it in your country into law. And none of this is ever mentioned election time. Never will be. And they know too that a lot of people are so overwhelmed with entertainment and electronic lifestyle they have today that they don't really care. And that's why we're in the mess we're in today. And you're seeing the side effects that you complain about without realizing the causes. There's lots of side effects. There's endless side effects to complain about. Why is this happening? Why is that? Well, look at the causes. Look who says it all. You don't have democracies. And they're taking into this communitarianism with their private NGO leaders. They'll be the new commissars for your sustainable communities. From Hamish and myself from Ontario, Canada, it's good night to me. Your God or your gods go with you.